Episode 136, Nolan Higdon. Nolan Higdon is a political analyst, author, and academic. He writes the Gaslight Gazette over on Substack and collaborates with the amazing Project Censored. We first crossed paths via Substack over a cordial disagreement on Section 230. That's a communications policy. Yeah, anyway, I won't get into the weeds on that, but you can check it out elsewhere. And after that, we started collaborating. I did his podcast. He has done this podcast. And now we're doing some live streaming together. So please welcome to the show, Nolan Higdon. What's up, everybody? Some show updates. Anti-Fascist Pasta Night is moving along. Shout out to everyone who came out in Pittsburgh and virtually over on Zoom as part of the Inspire COVID Cautious Arts Festival. And we got May 16th, Los Angeles, California, June 5th, New York City, New York, and then August 6th through 30th, I will be at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, Scotland. You can get tickets and all information at my website, ronplacone.com. And, of course, Left at Wall is out now. Have you watched Left at Wall yet? It is a fun, anti-capitalist comedy about family that calls out the Wall Street machine. A lot of great comics are in it, and you can watch it on a bunch of platforms right now. It's on Apple TV, it's on YouTube Movies, it's on Google Play, it's on Xbox, it's on Amazon. You can buy it on DVD, but I recommend watching it on Tubi because Tubi is free. I like Tubi. Tubi's a really cool platform, so if you're not sure what platform to pick, I highly recommend Tubi because it's a cool platform and it's free. There you go. All right, enjoy today's episode. Nolan Higdon, good to see you again.
Good to be here, man. Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. It was really cool to chat with you on your podcast, and so I'm stoked to flip the script, as it were. So I always start at the beginning of these. So give me a little bit of insight. Where did you grow up? What were some of your interests as a kid? Kind of share the origin story as you like to present it.
I was born in this great state of Kentucky, Owensboro, Kentucky. My dad was from there. My mom was from California, and I was a couple months old. We moved out to California, so I basically grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area most of my life. Typical, I don't know, suburban life. I love sports, big pro football fan, huge pro wrestling fan. Really kid of the 80s, so I grew up on television, sitcom, situation comedy, all those kinds of things. And then, some point as I got older, I worked a bunch of jobs here and there, and eventually went off to college and just kind of did the transition, spent some time in UC Davis and San Diego and San Francisco. So a lot of California in me.
What pushed you to your area of study? Like what kind of got you into media literacy and all the work you've done?
Yeah, it's a good question. I had I think a lot of people in my generation have this story, but the 2003 invasion of Iraq was the moment. I'd always been interested in history as a kid because my grandparents were from Ireland, and so they would tell me stories about growing up there during like World War II, and I was just like, captivated. Like, it's one thing to see the war image on TV, but to like hear people tell you their firsthand accounts, I'd ask them the same stories over and over again. And did it with my dad. He grew up in like Kentucky, and it was just like such a different environment than California where I grew up. I would like love his old stories about the farm and stuff. So I was really into history, and I sort of went to college with the intent of being a historian, which I mostly did. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq was one of the most amazing things I had ever seen, which was just the way in which the Bush administration and the news media lied the public into supporting that war. And originally I thought, okay, well, I want to study the history of like war and propaganda. That's where I spent a lot of my time looking at that. But you sort of get to the point in life where you're like, okay, you can be like the wet blanket at the party who tells people how like idiotic the country is and it falls for, or you can be part of like the solution. And that's what drew me to kind of media literacy. Like, well, what can we do to prevent audiences from falling from this stuff in the future? And that question was a lot more empowering to me than just kind of, memorizing and telling the history. And at the same time, I was just getting in the classroom and teaching, and teaching is the coolest job in the world. You're around like all these young minds with these different ideas, and they interpret things totally differently than you. And It was just really challenging to think about, like, well, how do you teach this to a new generation, one that's now using smart devices or TikTok? I think that kind of like hunger and curiosity always drives what I do.
Yeah, teaching is, I really did enjoy teaching whenever, I didn't do it a lot, but I did really enjoy it. And, obviously, like, if I wouldn't have gone into what I went into, like, I would have been an academic. It's well, so where did you do like post undergrad? What was your trajectory there? Where did you do master's, PhD, and what were kind of like your focuses?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say one thing though. You said about you, if you didn't do what you did, you would have done teaching. I was also a drama kid in high school, and I had a drama teacher who stayed friends with me when I went into the profession. And her advice to me was, "Oh, you're going to do fine because you know how to work on stage. Like these are interchangeable jobs, like teaching and stage work." In my undergrad, I looked primarily at race history. I was interested in like plantation slavery, the Civil War era, 1840s. And when I went to get my master's, I was looking at doing something that was like the intersection of media and race. I wasn't really sure. I ended up doing wartime propaganda during the Mexican-American War. And I was in history and Latin American studies. And then I did that in San Diego, which, San Diego, like, that's their bread and butter down there. So that was really eye-opening for me. Learn a lot more about Central and South America. We're like up in the Bay, we mostly only kind of focused on like the wars and revolutions. I got a much more like cultural understanding of Central and South America in my time in San Diego, which was really cool. And then I did my doctorate in ed at San Francisco State. So up in the Bay while I was teaching. And, I've taught community colleges, state universities, R1 universities, private colleges. I've done it all. And, they're all different for different reasons. Every class is different because you have different students, but it's a really fun career. It's challenging, keeps you on your toes.
So then once you have the academic career, first of all, explain Project Censored to anybody who may not be familiar, and then follow up with that with how did you come to be involved with Project Censored?
Well, this goes back to the beginning of the story. I mentioned how the WMDs thing really changed my life. Well, that was right in the run-up to the war. And the teacher there was Mickey Huff, who would go on to be the future director of Project Censored. And, he just blew my mind because at the time, all the news media was saying that Saddam definitely had these weapons of mass destruction and the Bush administration knew. And here's this like teacher in a classroom saying like, no, that's all BS. This happens all the time. You guys are going to find out it's a lie. And much to my surprise, he was right. That's exactly what happened like 2 years later. And so throughout my, I left, I would do my undergrad and do my master's, but I always stayed in contact with him and worked with the project, like writing on the book and researching. And, finally just you're around long enough, you just become part of the project. But the project is Project Censored, and they started in the 1970s. And they started because this is actually a product of Watergate. After Watergate, a lot of people wanted to be journalists. It became like kind of a popular profession because it took down a president. And you've got the movie, All the President's Men. And this was started by a sociologist at Sonoma State University named Carl Jensen. And he had an interesting background. He came from the advertising world. But he was looking back with his students at the reporting years before Watergate. And the Watergate story had been reported by the independent press before the Washington Post and New York Times took it up. And he asked this question, like, well, how come all these people were reporting it, but the big papers weren't? Like, why was it, in his words, censored? And so he created this project with his students where every year they would look at stories that the students would argue are newsworthy, and then they would check to see if they were covered in the corporate press or mainstream media, some people call them. And if they weren't, they would be sent out an annual list. This was known as the Project Censored's Top 25 Censored Stories list. And the project continues to do that today through books and graphics. It's expanded a lot. In addition, it also looks back. So they have a deja vu chapter where they look back at the stories that were previously censored to see if they were covered. And what I've noticed kind of anecdotally, we've always talked about doing research on this, but Usually what's in Project Censored's top 25, the public will find out about it about 3 years later. You're usually about like 3 years ahead of the news cycle if you read Project Censored. They have a junk food news chapter, which is what Carl created. It's called Twinkies for the Brain. That's the content that looks like news, but it's really bad for you and it's meaningless. This is like, chasing the Kardashians or whatever. They also have a news abuse chapter where they look at where news media do cover stories, but they frame them or introduce them in a way that takes away from like the more important aspects of it. And, they've got a whole team over there and it's done in any classroom in America can participate. If you're a faculty member and you want to nominate one of the censored stories, they usually get about, I think, 300 to 500 a year, and the top 25 make the book.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so how long has it been now for Project Censored? Like what?
They are about to celebrate their 50-year anniversary.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if somebody just asked you, and I know Dr. Robert McChesney wrote The Problem of the Media. If somebody who maybe just has a basic lay understanding of things going on in the world and has an average, media diet of whatever, how would you address the problem of the media? How would you explain that to them?
I would say I think the biggest problem is we have the illusion of diversity, but not actually diversity in coverage. I think a convenient kind of thing to lay the land for people is you see all these news outlets across the country, but really 90% of news media is owned by about 5 or 6 corporations. And because they're corporate, their focus is on profit. And so things that may be important, like overseas reporting or small, like rural communities, that stuff is too costly for a corporation. So they cut that type of reporting. Instead, we find out what's going on in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Chicago and Boston. Like these big markets, they'll have reporters there, usually not on the weekends. So God forbid you live in a small town and have a disaster on the weekend. Those kinds of things just aren't reported. And so we get a very narrow perspective and a narrow slice of life. And I think we see it in times like what we're seeing right now with Iran. It's not necessarily that everybody in media is part of some like big, club where they're trying to collude together. A lot of these folks have just never been to Iran. They haven't studied Iran, but there's a dearth of journalists. So they just put some, guy from New York into like an embassy near the war, and they're supposed to report back to the public what's going on. And it's for those reasons Americans miss out on a lot of what's going on. I think there's also, so that's one problem. Another problem is these corporations have other interests, right? Like Jeff Bezos famously bought Washington Post. Washington Post is not going to be critical of Bezos' Amazon. That would cost Bezos money. He's not going to spend money to cost himself money. Or they have desires, like they don't want to be regulated or targeted by the Trump administration. So they attenuate their reporting not to frustrate the Trump administration. That seems to be what CBS is doing now with his allies in there. So some of this stuff is not, I think it's sometimes presented as like a big conspiracy, like all these media people are working behind the scenes to lie to you. No, it's just the infrastructure, the way it's designed, the perverse incentives of the industry. Because if you talk to journalists, which I do frequently, off the record, journalists are like some of the most radical people. Like they have a really sober sense of what's wrong in the country and with the reporting, but they need to keep their job. And to do that, like they know where the boundaries are of acceptability.
So what do you think the fix is for all that?
Well, I think there's 2 critical areas. One, you're definitely a part of. I think creating and maintaining alternative media is critically important for however we can to get alternative narratives out there. I think we've seen some great successes in recent years. I mean, I think what like Breaking Points has done, I think is incredible. They now get like sitting Congress people on their show, and they're essentially giving you like a deep populist take on news narratives, right? That's their sort of slant or bias. So creating those, I think, is important, but we also have to confront the fact that these big monopolies have to be broken up because even this like new media space, it's a handful of corporations that control the internet. And like YouTube, for example, has been caught demonetizing Epstein videos, which is some of the most popular content. Should YouTube really decide whether or not it's economically advantageous for you as an independent reporter to report on Epstein? I mean, those kinds of things, I think, are going to come to a head. We saw that with Gaza, certainly. So there's some area where I think independent reporting can do a lot, but we're still constrained by those corporate power. And I think breaking that up would make it a lot more difficult for corporate interests to do those kinds of things.
how could such a thing happen? Like what would be the anatomy of something like that becoming a reality in a place like the U.S.?
Yeah, this is where we get to the age-old frustration conversation of leftists, because like anti-corporate leftist power depends on collective organization. And I think when people hear that, they think of like the protests in the streets. And don't get me wrong, protests in the streets are hugely important. But protests in the streets are not movements. Movements are organizing that collective towards specific goals where they're able to find and utilize certain pressure points that power have to demand concessions and change. We're a long way away from that. Like you need to have on the ground organizing, and that necessitates community building, having organizations, and they don't need to be political organizations. So like, I'm not saying like everyone needs to join like, the Democratic Socialists of America. You could literally have a book club or a gardening club or a bowling club or whatever, magic cards club, whatever people do. You could have some club like that, but it's building some sense of community and connection. And it seems really easy, but it's really difficult. All of our incentives are against that. It's much more toward individualism. Even the new media space I was talking about, like, it's so atomized. They're competing with each other. It's not like sharing one umbrella of working together. That's because they're playing the capitalist system, right? That's what it is essentially. So I think it's breaking that frame, getting that collective action, and having people who are willing to take risks over career. That's why I would say academics are like really bad organizers, because they'll end up writing a book and furthering their career on the revolution. They're not actually going to get on the ground and risk said career for the revolution. So you need the people, those kind of risk takers. And then this is why I said leftists get frustrated with this conversation, because then it gets much in the abstract. Like leaders aren't appointed, leaders emerge. These are people that capture something that's going on in the collective, and people have faith in them, and they maintain that in a good faith way and use it. You need art and culture, something that speaks to that feeling and drives that like unknown emotion to connect those people. So I think those are the things that movements really need. But again, in this overly sanitized, corporatized, individualistic environment, it's very difficult.
Well, who are some contemporary leaders, if there are any, that you can point to now?
I don't know if anybody's really kind of captured. I think we often conflate like popularity or fame with kind of capturing that emotion. But I think some of the, like, I don't know if they still would call them leaders, but like people who emerge, I think, with an opportunity to become leaders, like the kids after like the Sandy Hook shooting, for example, they captured something in all of us. At some points, like I think like Greta Thunberg did that for some people, right? She captured something in people. It's those kinds of things. I wouldn't pick any of those people to be leaders before they had emerged, right? They just didn't seem like they had that but they do. They have that kind of moment where they can capture it. And getting more and more of those kind of folks together. I think we do have a lot of like inspirational like artists and talking head folks, especially in like the new left media space. I think they're there. But we need those kind of like on the ground inspirational figures. I thought like, I don't know, like people like Killer Mike, I think are interesting. Folks like that, they capture just something that's intangible that draws that attention.
So what do you think will be the future of journalism? Like just not even just in the United States, but just in the world? Because it's like, I feel like we've completely lost the idea of journalism as a public good. Not that we ever fully had it, but like we've just completely lost it more now than arguably ever before. Where do you think it's all heading, and can it be a sustainable thing?
I think so. I like to think that, I know it's kind of really been overused, but like, people have that saying about how, America, does the right thing after it's exhausted all other options. I keep waiting for that kind of like breaking point, come to Jesus moment where people recognize like what it's going to be like in a post-journalistic world, or what it's going to be like in a post-democracy. And I think we're rapidly approaching that edge, and you're seeing people start to ring the alarm bells. So I'm not total doomer. I think there's a lot there. The Trump administration's power the way he utilized it really did frighten me. But then I started to see things the way in like Epstein files or Minnesota protesters, or even the way the public hasn't really gone with this Iran thing. That gave me some hope that, okay, there's still some like sensible people out there who care about like the humanity. So I think it's there. I'd like to see that turn into a backlash that's not just vote blue no matter who, but actually a policy agenda that prevents us from getting into a position like this in the future. I'm also inspired by, frankly, young people, what they're doing with media. And some of it, even as someone who studies it, I don't totally understand it, but I know it's working. Like some of these like TikTok graphics where they're trying to explain deep concepts, that we have to write like books on to understand. They're getting enough of the message out there to the right audiences in some respects, including in pushing back in things like the Iran war. So I think it'll be different. I think there's a lot of potential, but I do think, the alarm is ringing. This is something we need to decide. And we brought up Bob McChesney earlier. One of the things that Project Censored always critiques is that money affects the story that you tell. Kind of like I was talking about earlier, how corporations shape their narratives to benefit their corporate interests. So that's one argument against the public funding of media, right? It's like, are you going to essentially create like government arms of the government in the media system? But McChesney had an interesting backlash idea to that, which was called democracy dollars, where you give every U.S. citizen a certain amount of money that they can donate to any news outlet of their choosing. So it's a way to keep journalism alive, keep government funding it, but get rid of those kind of perverse incentives for government to shape it. I'm sure it would have problems and kinks like everything does, but I think things like that, thinking outside of the box as ways to help secure journalists are going to become critically important. And I'm excited to see what the industry tries to do there.
Are there any media structures around the world that you would point to and say, hey, this is, not perfect because such a thing doesn't exist, but this is like an example of a country that kind of has the right idea for a healthy news infrastructure?
I'll preface this by saying I'm going to address the attack on this answer. I think mid 20th century United States is what I would ask for again. And as soon as you say that, people say like, oh, here's a white guy talking about when there weren't white guys and women in news media. But that's actually not true. Now, the mainstream dominant papers, yes, they were all white guys, straight white guys. That's a problem. I'm not advocating for that. But back then, there were so many more publications, periodicals, whether it be magazines, small markets, stuff tailored directly to audiences like black magazines like Jet and Ebony, women's magazines, of course, like Now and Miss Magazine. So they did have more outlets. Now, again, the mainstream didn't diversify, and that is the problem of the era. But I think a lot of people throw that out as like, oh, there were no women and journalists of color. And that's just simply not true. There was a much more diversity of ownership. By the 1980s, about 50 corporations controlled 90% of our media. So it was much more diverse. I think going back to something like that model, but, have diversity, including in the dominant media, would be a much better model that we already had. I mean, I think a lot of the ideas in terms of news media from that era are really great in terms of what was even like 60 Minutes. I know it's an old person show, but the format is genius to me. It's a news magazine. You get like a little bit of in-depth reporting on a handful of stories through broadcast media. That's essentially what like podcasts are doing now. So I think like a lot of those kind of ideas are still out there. We just need to find a way to resuscitate. And if we keep this capitalist economy, which I imagine we will, keep resuscitated economically as well.
No, I hear you. I mean, my personal answer to that question is like somewhere in the world contemporarily, I would say Norway, like the way Norway has their media structure, like they have like an appointed board that consists of academics and journalists and media makers, and they have these particular rules around ownership, and I think they even have a law like you can't have commercials of any kind on like news and media, and so I think that's like a pretty good way to do it. And I think that, and this is, total Big Chesney. So I'm sure, but back in the day when we just had the newspaper subsidies, that was like the most ideal way to run a media infrastructure in any type of democratic experiment. And so it's wild that we started off with arguably the greatest idea and then morphed into this absolute disaster.
Yeah, and as you brought up the regulatory framework back then, they had a cap on how many news outlets you could own in a particular market.
Right.
They got rid of that in '96. They used to have a fairness doctrine. You used to have to bring on views you cited for equal time. They got rid of that officially in 2012, but really in 1987. So like all these things were in place. There was a much better media environment, but I think a lot of people have kind of thrown it away from the narrative that it was all dominated by white men. And I'm like, it's actually much deeper and than that when you go back and look at it.
So getting to, I mean, you talked about like young people spreading messages and on TikTok and what have you. What's kind of your overall take on what is, in the pipeline amidst young people, like amidst Gen Z and then Gen Alpha? Like, do you find hope in those generations, especially as an educator?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to educate
really?
in this environment.
Sure.
Because, and again, I know it always sounds like old man blaming kids, but no, it's not. They have so many distractions built into their life that even those who want to learn, really heck, I struggle. I always trying to like read books and I somehow end up checking my phone. I'm like, this is all of us. So I think that's one of the challenges they have. Politically, though, I think at least I think as born in the 80s kid, I was born in a time of much like more effective propaganda. It was 80s. We hated the Soviets and, Reagan was God and we were the good country and the economy was coming back and all that crap. It was lies. For them, I mean, there's not really a mask on this empire anymore.
Right.
and they're feeling the reality of it. I don't think you can understate what we're talking about, how my generation, like the WMDs, was transformative. For this generation, I don't think you can erase what happened in Gaza. They had been filled with so much of this social justice rhetoric from like the neoliberal left about building empathy and respect for others, particularly communities of color or difference. And they did that for what they saw happening in Gaza. And they were attacked as like conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites. They were told that the university is a place to stand up to power, and all the marketing materials have these students protesting from the 60s. They got in there and did that with the Gaza encampments. They got steamrolled by their own university and like police forces. They're going to remember that. That leaves a mark on them. And they know that was done with the Democratic Party in power. Some of them, I would argue naively, but whatever, thought that Trump was going to offer a reset on that issue, and he just doubled down. Mm-hmm. So I think those kinds of things are going to leave an indelible mark on a generation. And the good part, I guess, is they'll be much more skeptical and probably cynical of power, which is what we need in a moment like this.
Well, what I love about the younger generations, like younger than millennial, because I'm a millennial, so anyone younger than that. But like capitalism is a dirty word, and that's just so common, and I just freaking love to see it, because when you and I are around the same age, when we were growing up, a lot of people wouldn't go that far, but now, oh man, they have no that they're just done with it, and it's inspiring to see, and I do find hope in the young people. Like every generation, there's there's pros and cons, like these younger generations. Some of them are calling out capitalism and calling out the empire, and they have access to all this information and they're really filtering it well. Some of them reading Tide Pods, apparently. So it's like you take it all in, just like, there were some great boomers who really set the bar for what it means to stand up against war. There were others who decided, screw it, I'm going to become a banker. It's like every generation had the good and the bad. But yeah, no, the young people today, I'm kind of excited to put them in charge. I actually feel like we should just sort of skip our turn and let them take over. I look at some of the stuff like, oh, Joe Kennedy, Pete Buttigieg. You know what? We're going to skip our turn. Millennials, we skip our turn. We're handing it off to you.
God, I know. I forgot, I'm blanking on the author, but there's some book who wrote It's Our Turn, talking about millennials. They were citing the Pete Buttigiegs of the world as an illustration of our moment has come.
It's like, because you even look at someone like Mamdani. I don't think he's younger than millennial, right? Like he's, or is so, or is he like the youngest millennial? He might be like the youngest, actually.
Yeah, he's got to be right there, but I think he's like 33.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he might be like tail end. All right. So older millennials will skip our turn.
Yeah.
I'm one of the older ones. Like older ones, we're skipping our turn. We're gonna just bypass the Buttigiegs of the world, and we'll skip our turn. Like, but well, as an academic, I mean, seeing what's happening, especially right now, what do you think is the future of academia in the United States? I mean, can it be salvaged?
Well, funny you should ask. So I just have a book coming out called MAGA Academy, and it looks at the corporate destruction of higher ed. And the story it basically tells is that higher education, when done properly, can and should be a threat to power. That's one of the things I think a lot of, like you were kind of just saying about the 60s and boomers, a lot of the stuff is kind of overstated, but look, they did threaten power. They freaked out the country, and it was, because they're some of the most privileged white kids who are now turning on the system that they benefit from. And they were aligning themselves with folks like civil rights leaders, like the black people, which I was like, to the previous generation, and then fighting against things like wars. I mean, it scared the shit out of the establishment. And from there on forward, the story of the 1970s was really about dismantling these kind of public structures, whether it be media, like we were talking about, or higher education. There's a very famous memo called the Powell Memo, where Lewis Powell was a conservative thinker and judge. He basically told these corporations, like, look, we got to start doing what the unions and the activists are doing. We have to band together, and we have to start using our money to transform these systems. We need to go after their credibility. We need to, go after the funding of them, the leadership of them. And the Powell Memo was all about doing that to these institutions. And higher education was one of them. They found the greatest salesman in the world, which was Ronald Reagan, who, if you'll forget this, he was the union leader of SAG. At the same time, he was also an FBI informant, turning in the people he was representing, just to give you an idea of who Ronald Reagan is. But when he was president, he issued a lot of reports on education in the country. And one of them, Nation at Risk, said that schools were basically failing the country because the students weren't learning, and then they weren't being good capitalist producers, and they weren't prepared for the global market. So everything was going to fall to shit. There were other reports that said the opposite, but he chose that one because, again, Reagan. And that report was used that, look, we need to get more accountability and efficiency in schools. And obviously we're spending all this money and it's not working according to this report. So we need to tie this money to certain outcomes. And this started the corporate transformation of education in general, but higher education in particular, where they started producing less tenure track faculty and more administrators. These are people from the so-called professional managerial class. Their skill is supposedly they know how to manage people in education, even though they never walk into a classroom. And if they do, they wouldn't know what to do. But they created these huge bureaucracies where schools became everything but learning. And in replacing tenure jobs with so-called contingent faculty, these are folks who get paid less. They're hired usually term to term. They usually have to work on 2, 3, 4 campuses at once to make a living. And as a result, they, one, are a lot more afraid of speaking truth to the administration because they could lose their job. They can be fired for any reason in most cases. 2, they're on so many campuses, you really can't have union meetings where they're included. And so you have a much weaker faculty, and the faculty with less tenure faculty couldn't participate in what they used to call shared governance, which is where decisions were made by all the stakeholders, students, administrators, and faculty. So they hired more administrators to take on that bureaucratic work. And this was the story of faculty losing power. Because you can be fired for any reason, you also don't take risks in the classroom. Your academic freedom is really weakened. And the funding for schools became less from taxpayers and more from private money. So now it was a question, can your program get funded? Well, STEM will always get funded, right? Because private industry wants public schools to do all the R&D, and then they'll take the working product and sell it on the market. But things like history, civics, all these kinds of things, they fall by the wayside. And so now you can see this in the marketing materials. If you go to higher education, they sell it as a job factory. It's an invisible ticket into the middle class. And faculty who want to, like we were talking about, critique capitalism or prepare students for activism or pushing back against real power, they're almost like a laughable joke or a relic of like a dying era in a lot of these eras. Like the right always tries to pretend like faculty lounges are a bunch of like Marxist rhetoric. I'm like, no, it's a bunch of like vapid careerism. That's what's going on in these faculty lounges. So I say all that because in the book I point out that that's Donald Trump walked into that version of higher ed, and he was able to really easily steamroll it because faculty had little power. He knew what schools wanted, which was money. So he withheld their money if they didn't give concessions, like get rid of DEI or whatever it may be. And he's really transformed higher ed, but I think he's pushed it more in the direction that it was already heading. And in a lot of ways, Democrats, as much as previous Republicans, have to take part of the blame. And the faculty who honestly supported this crap got it to this moment. And so to your question about how it changes, I don't know. I mean, higher ed has never had such a bad image in the public as it does right now. And that's part of right-wing nonsense from like the Charlie Kirks of the world and David Horowitz, who always talked about how horrible higher ed was. But it's also like some of the stuff we did in higher ed was pretty friggin' ridiculous. Like the language managing and like the programs and the dean's names, or claiming we were like empowering students to be transformative leaders and like all this like hyper social justice rhetoric when really we were just training like corporatists. I mean, a lot of that stuff didn't land well in the public. So I think it's going to be tough to turn around because I'm not sure the public really cares about higher ed in a way that it did like 40, 50 years ago.
It's why, well, I mean, when I was in graduate school, and of course, this is a generalization because I've also, I made some amazing friends and colleagues there too. But, I was pretty kind of set back by just, I felt like I was just amidst a sea of like half-baked Ayn Rand bullshit. It was like, what is this? Like, this isn't what the academy's supposed to be. We're supposed to be the radicals. We're supposed to be the thinkers. And meanwhile, it's like a lot of, and now part of it could have been like my program as well, but it's like, the leftists kind of had to like close the doors and be hush hush. And that was among the reasons I didn't continue. I mean, it wasn't the only reason, but it was among the reasons I didn't continue because I felt like I was just sort of in a corporation fueled by textbooks.
That's actually an apt description. I think that is the description of how it is. Like, I remember like I had the same thing. I thought I was going to go into some like radical bastion of the 60s when I went to like grad school. And it was like, no, totally careerist. At one point I wanted to add like a labor organizing lens to my research. And I'm not kidding you. I had to be at least 5 faculty members told me like, now the labor history research stuff, that's dead. and I didn't know what that meant. Later on, I realized what they meant. They thought like, hey, it's a post-Cold War world. We're beyond like this union labor organization class analysis. But those are the kind of things that are just baked into the cake there that it's radical. It's usually in spite of like the classes you're taking, not because of them.
Yeah. Well, so how do you... especially since you are out there in the public big time, like with podcasts and publications, how do you navigate those waters? Like when I see people like you and Dr. Gabriel Rockhill and Mickey Huff, I'm just like, man, how are those guys able to stay employed?
I think about that.
Someone's got to be trying to get rid of them.
Oh yeah. God, yeah. Well, I think, one thing is if you build a kind of public persona, it's a little more difficult for them to touch you because then they know that if they go after you, you're probably the kind of asshole who will bring it up publicly and like shame them or make it into a deal. So that can sometimes be leverage to your advantage. Also, the reality is like most people in academia don't read or pay attention to each other's work. Like I would be interested if you polled like my campus, how many people actually know my work exists, like just in general. So I think you're kind of under the radar somewhat in that. They usually all stick to like the same journals and the same like kind of circles and things like that. And that's why like, you brought up like Huff and Rockville, like we all know each other because we go to the same conferences. It's like the same like 100, 200 of us who from around the country who get together and talk with one another. But it's really rare. But I'll tell you that like students are really attracted to it. And usually when they take classes, and this isn't just from me, this is some of the folks you named and others, They talk about kind of the moral conundrum they find themselves in. 'Cause once you take the mask off the system, their whole life has been geared toward like this career and success in the system. But now they're also recognizing like the problems with it or the shortcomings or the lies of it. And so they have like an internal struggle. And my goal in life is not to make them feel this internal struggle, but they're attracted to like that notion. Like the idea these students are all just like careerists and don't care about these things. That's a total, like, I think, pop culture myth. If you put this stuff in front of young people, they're actually really attuned to it. And they're really interested in like figuring out how they're going to navigate that once they're aware of it. And they find it important.
Where do you find your hope, if you have any?
So I don't read fiction. I'm not a big fiction reader. This is a big critique everybody has of me. But the closest thing I have to it is I like to go back and read like history and look at the past. Sometimes I do this like not even consciously. Like right now I've read like a bunch of books on the first Gilded Age. And I'm always just struck at history not necessarily repeating itself, but it certainly rhymes. And how like these eras are together and how you just watch these people emerge from places that don't make any sense or it seems impossible at the time. And they make this like transformative change under sometimes like the worst circumstances. And so I always take hope from looking at history. I also try and use history to kind of put things in perspective, like as bad as things are and the odds we're up against right now. I don't think it holds a candle to like, the blacks and plantation slavery. I don't think it holds a candle to what Jews were experiencing in Nazi Germany. And if those folks could resist, certainly at high cost, but if they could resist and ultimately come out on top, I don't see any reason why we should be hopeful we could do the same.
All right. I like that. Well, in closing, plug away, tell everyone where they can go to learn more about you, where they can file a complaint if their child is one of your students. No, I'm just kidding. But tell everyone where they can learn more about you.
I did have a former student reach out to me about a week or two ago, and she said, I've thought that ever since I took your class, it's the reason why I keep getting stopped by TSA at the airport.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Dude, I had a student once. This was, and I didn't teach very long. Actually, I'll share this with you before you plug away, because I have said this publicly, but I'll say it to you. So I was starting to get more and more road work as a comedian. I was living in Nashville at the time, and I taught community college kind of on the side. I was offered a full-time teaching schedule as an adjunct, and I didn't accept it because it literally would have been a pay cut. I was making more money. I mean, both were not lucrative jobs, but I was making a better living as a road comedian, not a famous one, not even a headlining one, an opening one.
Which one had the better crowds?
It depended on the day. It depended on the day. But as much as I love teaching, stand-up is a little bit more fun. So I was just like, well, I'm having more fun and I actually make a better living in comparison just doing this full time. So I turned it down. I was like, I'll keep doing a like one class a semester if you want me to, but that's it. And it did blow my mind that it was that. Yeah, I don't know how adjuncts survive. I think a lot of them don't. Like it's rough.
No, and a lot of them are like stuck too because they put so much time and money into those degrees, and then by the time they realize they're not going tenure, they're like 10 years in, which means they're 10 years older, and it's like very difficult to switch careers. It's pretty dark. So good move.
Well, where can people go to learn more about you?
They can. So I have a Gaslight Gazette, which is a it's supposed to be bi-weekly, but it's been weekly thanks to Epstein and Iran. Newsletter that I send out on Substack. That's at nolanhigdon.substack.com. You can get all the information there. If you go to nolanhigdon.substack.com/MAG Academy, that's MAG Academy, all one word. You can hear about the new book when it comes out. And because I've worked with them for so long, definitely check out Project Censored.org and follow them on social media. They're doing so much cool stuff right now. I highly recommend it. And dude, thanks for having me on, man. This was like really fun. Time blew by.
Absolutely, Nolan. Thanks so much for doing this.
Absolutely.
That was Nolan Higdon. Check out all of his stuff. Subscribe to his Substack, and please subscribe to mine while you're at it. If you're not subscribed to my Substack already, please do so. It's just ronplacone.substack.com. I'm posting there every weekday, and I post the 1000 podcast there. So some of you might be like, well, we get this podcast from Substack. Yep, I post this podcast there. Music for the 1000 podcast is provided by Andrew Saxon. Be sure to check out his podcast, The Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Please do make sure you subscribe, leave us a review, leave us a 5-star. That helps get the word out about this show. And if you want to support us on the sustainability end, patreon.com/ronplacone. For Give What You Can level, you get all kinds of cool content. You get full stand-up clips not available anywhere else. We do a Zoom hangout once a month, and you get insider information on film and events, and you get the 1000 episodes before they're released to the public. And that's all for a Give What You Can level. Got a really cool community going on over on Patreon. All right, 136, getting closer to another decade, but not quite there yet. 140, next decade. It's coming up quick. You know, you just feel the time. You feel it fly by. All right, catch you next week. Peace.